Well, all right, all right, all right. Okay, okay, okay. We got a good one here, folks. We got an old video back in the day of Barbara Bush. You know, you got some people that believe Barbara Bush is a man. Well, if you had me personally, I was looking at the beginning of this interview, and me personally, the interviewer, this lady interviewing Barbara Bush, who's looking like a man in drag, by the way, sitting here. If you ask me, the interviewer looks worried. She looks uncomfortable. She looks kind of worried. She looks just very uncomfortable. Let's roll this footage.
Hello, I'm Roberta Crisson. This is Facets, Politics 80, one of a series of political interviews with ramifications for all of us this year of presidential elections. I'm privileged and pleased and honored to have next to me Mrs. Barbara Bush, the wife of presidential hopeful George Bush,
again.
who has privileged
Let's take it back again.
interviews.
Look how nervous she looks.
Hello, I'm Roberta Crisson. This is Facets, Politics 80, one of a series of political interviews with ramifications for all.
You know, and if that is a man, if they had a conversation and, you know, this is hypothetically speaking, what if she was talking in her manly voice and checked her right before this? She looks a little off. You know, I'm just saying.
Hello, I'm Roberta Crisson. This is Facets, Politics 80, one of a series of political interviews.
Her breathing. Her breathing. She's like nervous. She's very nervous.
Ramifications for all of us this year of presidential elections. I'm privileged and pleased and honored to have next to me Mrs. Barbara Bush, the wife of presidential hopeful George Bush, who has survived a harrowing 2 days to
Locked
get here
in on
and sit in here for our interview today.
Make
and
a
I'd like to
move.
welcome you and say hello to Pennsylvania. And I wish we had better weather for you, but hopefully it will.
And off the bat, off the rip, off the bat, look how big Barbara is compared to this woman here. Look at the arms. And it looks like an Adam apple right there. But look at the head. I mean, all of just, for me, it says drag. What does it say for you?
Clear soon. Mrs. Bush will be speaking with us today on issues that are near and dear to her heart and which she feels are of vital importance to the country as a whole. I'd like to begin our questions, if I could, Mrs. Bush.
Look how serious she's looking. She's looking so serious. Barbara is looking so serious. That looks like a dude in drag, and that looks like an intimidated woman by a man in drag. And that's just me, you know. That's just how I'm looking at it. I don't know if that's a woman or not, but from right here, it looks like a man. Let's keep going.
Rather serious note. You brought in your bag this morning with 2 small buttons on it. Mm-hmm. Something that you said was very important to you, and I'd like for you to explain those if you could.
Well, at a breakfast this morning, someone gave me 2 buttons, one for George and one for me, that had a 5-0 on it. This was they said I must wear it until we get back our hostages. And I said to the lady, but there aren't 50 hostages, there are 53 hostages. And I feel very strongly that the President of the United States has really let us down. There are 3 hostages held by the government itself and 50 held by the terrorist, so-called students. When the president says we've had a breakthrough, incidentally the day of a primary, we've had a breakthrough and maybe we're going to get the 50.
I don't know about you, But that just looks like a man talking like a woman. I mean, just look at it. Look at Barbara. Look at the forehead. That's not a man's forehead and jawline. It's okay. I'm not against it. It's okay. They can do whatever they want. They're powerful people. That's what powerful people do. They do weird things, right? Correct?
Shifted over to the government. Well, what difference does that make? They've had 3 all along, and they have not returned them to us. So the government is not acting in good faith. And when the president puts 50 Christmas trees to symbolize the hostages, I think it's a deception to the United States public. There are 53 hostages. So I think the button really is sort of sad.
What do you think should be done now? Do you think there are other steps that need to be taken?
Small forehead, small
No,
face
I think
woman.
the president has taken the right step. You know, George, about a month ago, before the Illinois primary, at a World Affairs luncheon in Illinois, called for breaking off diplomatic relations, the complete economic sanctions, and sending home the diplomats. Because he said, enough. We tried the World Court, it didn't work. We tried the United Nations Commission, it didn't work. We have got to show the Iranian government and the Iranian people that we are standing behind our commitments and our hostages. So I think the president has finally done the right thing.
Your husband said last night on an interview program that in the areas of foreign policy and foreign affairs, he feels that he has probably more experience than many of the other, or most of the other men in the race, especially in answer to one question to Ronald Reagan. He felt that his experience, especially in foreign policy, was what sets him apart from the others.
I think that's only one thing, Roberta. I think, certainly in foreign affairs, George is the only person running for president who has been a congressman, the ambassador to the United Nations, the chief of the U.S. liaison office to the People's Republic of China, a fourth of the world's population, incidentally, and the head of the whole intelligence system. So there's no question about that. And I think that George better understands the world as it is, and the fact that President Carter is reacting. He's not acting. He doesn't have a plan. He just reacts to pressures and to different problems that arise. He doesn't have a world plan for the United States foreign policy. I think George Bush is the only person who really understands the foreign policy situation. For instance, Governor Reagan, who is a fine man, but he has just the background Jimmy Carter had. He's a governor of a state. When asked what he should do about Afghanistan, he suggested that we blockade Cuba. Well, now, Cubans did not invade Afghanistan. The Russians did. So I think there's a difference in the background. I also would suggest that Governor Reagan, along with President Carter, vacillates a little bit, because when it came to boycotting the Olympics, they went back and forth and back and forth. There's no question in my mind, that awful as it is, that George was right about the Olympics. We must let the Russian people...
See, I believe that back in the day, people didn't know about transgenders, and people didn't know about people hiding behind the mask of being a woman. I believe that people just didn't notice back in the day. They weren't that smart. You know, they dumbed everybody down. It went from idol worship to book and paper worship.
People see that we are against aggression, that we are going to boycott the Olympics. You know, athletes are Americans too, and they're being asked to make a tremendous sacrifice. But better make that sacrifice than make one of serving your country in a war.
Your husband has stated that he does favor registration of the military, since you mentioned
He doesn't think that we need to reinstate the draft now, but he favors an equal registration across the board.
Is this
that's a
to
dude.
to
Like the Boy
equalize
Scouts.
the?
Looks so much like a man.
Yeah. Well, this is what I was getting at. I think to shore up a rather sagging volunteer registration. I understand that there are some shortages in middle ranks and what have you in the armed forces.
But of course, registration wouldn't do that, I don't believe. But it would just be like the Boy Scouts. You're being prepared. We're talking about a world in a terrible period. The absolutely unthinkable is to go to war. George feels that there is such a thing as peace through strength. He feels that we have a much better chance to keep our country out of war and have decades of peace if we are strong. But we have a much less chance if we are
that
weak,
just looks
and
like a
that goes
straight
across
man.
the board for defense spending.
This was my next question in terms of defense spending.
Man.
Your husband does favor an increase in defense
Yes.
spending in any particular areas.
Well, now, you've got me, Roberta, because I am not an authority on MIRVs and that kind of
Oh,
thing.
of course not.
But George, I believe, feels that we have to put back into the budget the defense methods that President Ford had in, that President Carter cut. I think President Carter's seeing that now. Plus, we must get back to the three-ocean Navy, which we have lost.
Yes.
So I think in those fields, that's not my field.
I can well understand it. That we wouldn't, none of us, I think, is an authority, especially on the areas of armed forces that need a special shoring up. But
of course,
he
you
does
see,
favor
George
the
is,
increased.
though, because he presented the intelligence and the estimates of what the Russians are doing to the President of the United States for almost a year. He knows about those things.
He stated last night that in order
I wish
to...
I'd heard him.
Oh, well, I certainly wish you were supposed to be there last night, as a matter of
Yes.
fact, weren't you? He stated last night that there was in order to blockade Cuba, as you were mentioning earlier, it would take almost our whole Atlantic fleet, which I think is indicative of what you're saying as far as our Navy
We no
resources
longer
are.
have a three-ocean Navy.
And
I would go a little bit further than George. I think if I were the Russians, I would say to myself, wouldn't it be
big hand.
grand if the Americans would blockade Cuba? That would take the fleet out of the Mediterranean, away from the Middle East, where the Russians really have their interests. And wouldn't it be like a chess game where we made the dumb move, I think.
it'd be interesting to see what would happen, but not very pleasant, I'm
No.
sure. Let's get to domestic affairs, which I'm sure concern all of us. We all have to buy food
Look at that back.
and pay taxes and heat our homes, and I'm sure this is on the minds of many, many voters, perhaps even more than some of the foreign affairs.
I'm sure that's true.
That back and that posture.
How does your husband feel about inflation? How would he control it? He doesn't like it, I'm sure. How would he control it?
Well,
what steps
let me
would he
first
take?
say that George is the best qualified to solve the inflation problems of anybody running for president this year, too. George is the only person running for president in 1980 who has built a business, who's rolled up his sleeves and from scratch built a business. And for 21 years, George wasn't lecturing on the free enterprise system. He was out there doing something about it. He was a pioneer in the offshore drilling contracting business. I think that's an important qualification for president. He knows what it is to take risks, meet payrolls, pay taxes, and deal with government regulations. Now, having said that, he also was a member of Congress and served on the House Ways and Means Committee, and he was a Phi Beta Kappa graduate majoring in economics. I think those are important qualifications. George says that in order to stop the inflation, you have to limit the growth of federal spending. That doesn't mean no growth. George believes that there is room for growth in the economy, but it should be under the rate of inflation. I am not an economist, but I have heard him say that. But you should limit the growth of federal spending. You should cut government regulations that are strangling the free enterprise system. And I've seen two wonderful examples of that this week on my tour. you should enact the sunset laws, and we should have a strong, inventive energy program. If you do those four things, he then says you can cut you can cut taxes by $20 billion, $10 billion to corporations and businesses with an incentive built in. You don't get the tax cut if you don't put the money back into the business for research and development, for retraining of people for jobs that are there, for moving to locations where there are where there is unemployment and training people to the jobs, and for energy conservation. The other $10 billion to go to private individuals if they will take that money and put it into savings, home building, and energy conservation. It's an incentive-oriented tax cut. And I think that's one of the things we've taken out of our businesses. We've made it so attractive, for instance, to a company who is making money, not to put money back in so that we can compete with foreign countries and have more productivity. We've made it more attractive for them to buy Sears Roebuck or Montgomery Ward or something else, but not to try to upgrade so they can compete with foreign countries. So that's George's solution. I think he's right. I'm very prejudiced.
I can understand that, and I would
Upgrade
probably
so
be in the same straits. I was wondering about a comment that I had heard your husband make about stimulating production as another aspect of solving some of our economic woes. Now, part of this you explained in terms of the incentive programs, and I was wondering if that would be, if there was any other area that would work along with this, such as other job programs to help unemployment.
Training people for jobs that are there. For instance, CETA. Not all good, not all bad, but lots of it are training people for jobs that aren't there. That's really unfair because you are taking hope from people.
In terms of training for jobs that aren't there, could you explain that?
Well, in Houston, Texas, for instance, we've trained thousands of people, and it turns out after they've gotten trained, the job isn't there for them. We ought to be training people for the jobs that are there, not for jobs that aren't there. But let me give you another example of government regulations, because I'm sort of full of that this week.
You mentioned that you had some examples of that.
Well, I really did. I went to Rosemont Child Care Center in Washington, D.C. last week, actually. It was a wonderful child care center in a Hispanic neighborhood, and they had a third Hispanics, a third blacks, and a third white. And they are teaching with bilingual trainings so that people keep their heritage. And it was a wonderful setup, run by loving, I never saw such wonderful, loving people. And they were wringing their hands because these are welfare mothers that have been able to go back to work because of the Title 20, whatever it is, grant, plus some local and some private. All of a sudden, the government comes in and says, you have to have one trained aide for every 3 children. It's unreasonable. I'm a mother of 5. I did not have to have 1.5 trained aides to bring up my children. I mean, it's just unreasonable. So what happens is they can't take more children, and mothers who are eager to get off welfare and eager to have their children in this program. It's a combination of the best of Project Head Start and the best of training people off welfare. It's a marvelous program, but government regulations are killing them. I went to Lancaster, Pennsylvania this week. Wonderful blind set.
I just can't see the Adam's apple. I'm looking for it. I just can't see it. But the size of the head and the shoulder and the frame of the body says man.